Hello and welcome back to the Life on the Wrist podcast. This last week there wasn't a ton of watch news. There was a few things that we'll discuss on this, but we'll also kind of go into or maybe expand on something that we read this week, which I thought was a really interesting topic, and that was watch trends and predictions for 2024. I know we're about 2 months into the year, and maybe this is a little bit late. But I thought I would at least walk through a really great article that was written by none other than Tony Trena over at Hodinkee. And then I want to offer sort of my own predictions for what I think we will see this year. And of course, we'll revisit them at the end of the year to see if I was anywhere close. First off, I'll just give a quick shout out to a piece that was released. It is a Chopard LUC 1860 Revolution edition. This was a steel cased watch with a incredibly beautiful gold guilloche main dial. This watch is really beautiful. I think it's a collaborative project, obviously, between Chopard and Revolution. And I do think it's a really beautiful piece, the dial. I've really gotten into sort of guilloche dials recently. We've had the opportunity to interact with a couple of guilloche dial pieces, one being that Longines that we had last year. And so it's been a very attractive sort of place to for me to sort of explore, and I think this kind of sums it up really, really nicely. So I'll leave a link in the show notes to Revolution's article where they talk about this. It's the Lucent steel with a incredibly beautiful gold guilloche dial. On to sort of the main topic that I wanted to discuss, and that was the watch predictions, or I guess what Tony Trena says is, don't call them predictions, four things to watch in the watch market in 2024. And I think he did a really nice job of not being too specific about what to expect this year, and kind of painted the year with more broad strokes, which I think was a really good way of doing that. So he kind of described how 2023 was the year of small watches, and many people are thinking that trend will continue. I'll sort of go through each of the trends that he thinks will sort of come about. The first one is speaking in broad terms, and he kind of described this in the way of, I think watch collectors for a very long time were interested in a very specific type of watch. It was steel sports watches, it was Rolex, Submariners, Tudor, Black Bays. You can even probably put in there some really interesting Blancpains or Panerais. But I think over the years, there's been a trend towards smaller, dressier, and gold watches. And I think what he says is he doesn't want to be too specific that will continue, but I think what he was describing is the idea that brands have acknowledged that collectors don't want the same thing over and over again. What they really are looking for is some sort of variety in their options. And I think brands are going to offer those types of things in 2024 to allow collectors to have some sort of individuality, or to allow for a little bit more of an interesting sort of enjoyment by collectors. Now, he did mention a few that I thought were kind of cool. He said they're not predictions, but he wanted to just give some ideas, things like Art Deco pieces from JLC or American watch brands like Elgin and Hamilton. Enamel dials are also something that might be interesting. And of course, things like Patek ellipses that are abnormal in the grand scheme of sort of maybe the collecting universe is where he thinks things might go. And I think these are great predictions. I think this applies both on the modern and vintage side. I'd say from the vintage side, I'm pretty excited to see sort of the trends and what people are interested in this year. I think if collectors do end up wanting to look for some variety in their watches, vintage is a great place to be. His next sort of I guess, broader stroke for 2024 was titled Winners and Losers. And the idea here was that he kind of wanted to sum up the idea that there are some watches that have fallen off in price. He mentioned that watches have declined in prices. I think there was a report by Morgan Stanley that said that prices had declined for the 7th quarter in a row, and that the report thinks that prices on the secondary market will continue to sort of linger for the next 6 months. And I think this is totally fine, and you could call these sort of the losing side of the market. However, one has to remember that that we're kind of going back to sort of pre-pandemic levels, hype prices, and I think that's good for the market. But what he did sort of caveat this with is the idea that there are other areas in the watch market where things have become extremely grown in popularity and have done really well. For example, the Cartier Bamboo Cuisine is a really great example of that. A lot of the vintage Cartier models are really great examples of watches that have done really well in the market. So I think there is going to be some sort of clear divide between things sort of dropping off in prices on the secondary market, but there's still going to be models that are extremely in demand, and they will be winners in this market. And I think that's very clear. His next sort of theme was talking about Omega and the idea that I think there was a lot of controversy, obviously, around the record-setting tropical Omega Speedmaster that sold at Philips that ended up being a Frankenstein watch, or a Franken watch, as well as the idea that there's a lot of hype around the Swatch Speedmaster collaboration that made Omegas extremely popular and maybe to some a little bit spoken about. However, I think in 2024 there will be more talk about Omega, and I think maybe on the auction side we'll see some good predictions, and that's sort of Tony's sort of idea here. I think it's also just a love for Omega and the fact that there are some really amazing pieces to talk about for these pieces. His last sort of prediction was titled Through the Looking Glass, and the idea here was more of a hope for 2024, and that was around the idea of transparency. A lot of the controversies around the watch industry have to do with the idea of transparency and people not being honest about their intentions in the market or their intentions of a specific watch. And I think that's something that makes it really difficult to operate in this space. So I think from him, it's just a hope that there'll be more transparency and less controversy over the next year. So as always, I'll leave a link in the show notes for you to see this article, and I think there are some really interesting points that are brought up by Tony in this article. But what I thought I would do is actually talk about some of the predictions that I have for 2024, and I won't sort of speak about my hopes. I'll kind of try and ground it a little bit more in what I see sort of happening. And the first is something that I've spoken about already, and that is green dials. So a few podcasts ago, I mentioned a couple of watches that were released at the LVMH Watch Week. Things like releases from Tag Heuer, from Zenith, from Hublot, that all featured green dials. And while this is a trend on the modern side, I definitely see this maybe becoming somewhat of a trend. We'll have to see what ends up happening in some of the in the upcoming watch events and watch releases for the year. We've obviously got 10 months to go here, so plenty of time to see if this trend sort of comes to fruition. But I'd say if you already have a lot of the LVMH group's companies releasing watches with green dials, it might come about that way. The next prediction is sort of in line with Tony's prediction, but I do think that there's going to be a continuation of interest in watches with unique designs. That can be from the way that the case is constructed to the way a movement is constructed, perhaps the way the lugs integrate with the case. I do think that these are still trends that people are finding interesting, and they want to explore these because as Tony mentioned in his article, and as I mentioned previously in this podcast, I think there's obviously been a shift away from your very traditional steel sports round pieces. There's still a lot of interest in them. However, I think the collector's mind has kind of been opened to different design pieces. So I think there's definitely room for modern companies to sort of explore this idea. They won't maybe sell as easily. I think that's the struggle with these, because on the modern side, a lot of the times you're seeing collectors who might be just getting into watches, but there also are a lot of collectors who have a lot of history in collecting and would be interested in buying something of a unique case design. If you're looking at vintage collectors, though, I think there's obviously going to be a ton of that, a ton of interest in interesting watches, because it's just an additional story that one can tell when thinking about the watch that they're collecting. My last prediction kind of aligns with Tony Treina's prediction about Omega. And I think vintage chronographs over the last, I'd say, 3 or 4 years have really taken a hit. I think Tony mentions a Longines 13ZN that sold for $36,000 US dollars. It was in a small auction house. I think that, even last year we had the opportunity to interact with a really beautiful Omega reference 2279 chronograph, and I think there wasn't a ton of interest in these pieces, and with maybe a nice sort of bump in Omegas that are going to be maybe some interest in Omegas, vintage chronographs I think present a whole lot of value for collectors and have been undervalued for a little bit of time. So I think vintage chronographs from Longines, from Omega, obviously Rolexes are going to be have a ton of interest in them, of course. But brands like that, maybe Lejour chronographs might see a renaissance in their interest. Tag Heuer chronographs will probably see some interest as well. So the hope is that, or at least the hope, I'd say, I hope that there will be some interest in these, because they really are incredibly valuable pieces for what they are. If you ever speak to a watchmaker, they'll tell you that cranial chronograph is one of the hardest things that one can do, or one of the hardest movements to put together. I've always remembered that, and thought that chronographs are some of the most interesting pieces of watch collecting. So those are definitely my predictions for 2024. We'll have to see if any of them are true or what happens. There's plenty of time left in the year for something else to crop up, and maybe a new trend to start, but we'll have to see. So yeah, green dials, interesting design, and vintage chronographs are kind of where I'm looking. Who knows? Maybe the Rolex Hulks or the Rolex Kermits might see some renewed interest in them. We'll have to see, and we'll have to wait and find out if that will be the case. I did want to mention quickly that a lot of the big auction houses are putting on their online winter sales. I think most of them take place in March. The Elton John auction is actually starting on, I guess it's the 21st of February, so it's going to be a day after this podcast is released. So if you are interested in any of those pieces, be sure to check that out. But I know I saw a lot of online, I got a lot of notifications about the auction houses. They're putting on their online sales. And of course, these sales are typically geared a little bit more towards the modern watches. I think Philips had a really, really nice Legacy Machine Perpetual from MB&F. So everything sort of, leans a little bit more over to the modern side. But if you are looking for some pretty exceptional pieces, there's always a nice online auction that you could probably participate in and find something that you're looking for, because it just seems to be getting harder and harder to find some of these pieces, in my opinion. I know last week we covered some of the vintage watches we're going to be covering on the YouTube channel and our website. If you didn't catch that podcast, be sure to refer back to the podcast before this. It would be, I think, episode, I can double check for you here. If you're on our website listening to this, it's going to be episode 162. But it's probably season 5 episode, I'd say 6 or 7. So you can go check out that latest podcast there as well. Hopefully we get some interesting watch news over the next week. It's been a little bit slow. I know in the USA it's President's Weekend, so maybe there's just a big exhale that the watch community is doing for now, but we'll have to see. Oh, actually, one big thing did happen on Instagram that I wanted to mention. Periscopes. If you don't know Periscope is extremely well. Educated is the wrong way of describing him. He knows so much about vintage watches, and he does a lot of reports where he tries to basically spot problems with watches that have come to market. A lot of the times they're at auction houses, and just tries to warn collectors of what's happening in the watch community, what's selling, and what things to avoid based on what he's seeing. A lot of the times he's calling out watches for being Franken watches, where it's pieces from a bunch of different watches put together. And I think he is easily one of the most important parts of the watch community right now, especially on Instagram. Anyway, his account was, I don't think it hacked is the incorrect term. I think what happened was it was suspended. His account was flagged for, I think, essentially copyright infringements, or and then he ended up, his account basically, I think, ended up being suspended, and I'll get the right, I'll tell you the right terms really quickly, because I think it's important for everyone to know. But essentially what happened to his account was it was suspended for 180 days because of, I think it was copyright infringements. It's so sad, because this has happened previously where he's called out specific individuals in the watch community, and then his stuff gets taken down. I think he is an extremely important part of the watch community and keeps really all of us safe, and I don't think you really should underestimate the importance of him in the watch community. So he has a new account, so go follow that. I'll put a link in the show notes to the account as well as his website, so you can kind of stay up to date on that. But it is unfortunate that these things happen. I think with that, we'll close out the podcast. Thank you guys so much for listening. If you are new to the podcast, be sure to follow us and share this podcast with a friend who might be interested in watches. If you wouldn't mind rating this podcast, it really does help me out. And with that said, guys, I will catch you in next week's podcast, and I hope you have a great week ahead of you.